The day they took her from the stone courtyard, the air smelled of rain and judgment. Serena's hands trembled against the ropes at her wrists, but not from the chill. Every eye in the gathering was on her, heavy with contempt. She had failed her duty, the one task the Lord's household expected of her, to bear a child for her husband. Now, stripped of her silks and pride, she was paraded before strangers as an example. The man they led her toward stood apart from the others. Broad-shouldered, with skin the color of burnished bronze and hair bound in tight braids, he did not smile at her shame, nor smirk at her misfortune. His expression was unreadable, and in that unreadability lay a strange, quiet power. Whispers rippled through the crowd about where he came from, what kind of man he was, and how he'd once been a prisoner himself. The guards shoved her forward. Her bare feet struck the wet cobblestones, each step pulling her further from the life she had known. When she stumbled, he caught her elbow, not roughly, but as though he didn't wish to see her fall. She looked up into his eyes, bracing for the cold disdain she'd learned to expect from men in the Lord's house. Instead, she found something startling, a flicker of pity, perhaps even defiance, as though he did not agree with what was happening. No one else noticed. The Lord announced her fate in a voice that rang like a gavel. Serena was to belong to this man now, for as long as he wished to keep her. The crowd murmured approval. The rain began to fall harder, streaking down her cheeks until she could no longer tell what was rain and what was tears. He didn't drag her away. He simply offered his cloak, draping it over her shoulders before turning toward the road. And somehow, in the space of that single gesture, the weight on her chest shifted, not gone, but lighter than she expected. The road wound away from the Lord's estate into the quiet edges of the valley, where the grass grew high and the trees bent over the path like old sentinels. Serena kept her eyes on the ground, the damp hem of her dress clinging to her legs, unsure whether to follow closely or lag behind. The man's stride was steady but unhurried, as though he knew she would come without needing to order it. When they reached the bend in the path, he glanced back, not to check if she was still there, but as if gauging whether she could keep walking. "It's not far," he said, his voice low and even. She had expected the rough bark of command, but instead his tone was almost considerate. She nodded without speaking, afraid that any words she might offer would sound brittle in the damp air. They reached a small house set into the slope of a hill, its walls built from dark timber and its roof covered in moss. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, carrying the scent of herbs and something warm. Inside, the air was different, soft with firelight, heavy with the smell of bread baking. He removed his cloak from her shoulders, shaking off the rain, and hung it beside the door. "You can sit," he said, motioning toward a wooden chair near the hearth. When she hesitated, he simply moved to the small table and began cutting slices from a round loaf, setting one before her with a wedge of cheese. She stared at it for a long moment before hunger overcame her wariness. While she ate, he busied himself with the fire, adding logs, checking the iron pot simmering in the embers. He didn't ask questions about her past, didn't comment on the reason she'd been sent to him. The silence between them was not oppressive, it was almost a shelter, a space where her shame did not echo so loudly. When she finally looked up, he was watching her, not with suspicion or desire, but with an expression she could not place, something between curiosity and a quiet promise that whatever her life had been before, it did not have to remain that way. The days that followed blurred into a rhythm unlike anything Serena had known. Mornings were quiet, broken only by the call of birds and the crackle of the hearth. He would rise early, leaving her with warm bread and a cup of herbal tea before stepping outside to work in the small patch of earth behind the house. Sometimes she watched from the window as he split wood or tended the rows of vegetables, his movements steady and deliberate. She had expected to be given orders, to be reminded each day of the disgrace that had brought her here. Instead, he asked nothing of her. When she offered to help with the fire or sweep the floor, he nodded in thanks, never in command. The absence of cruelty was almost unnerving. In its place was a patience she did not know how to meet. One afternoon, while rain swept across the valley in silver sheets, she stood in the doorway watching him repair a broken fence post. Mud clung to his boots, water ran down his face, yet he worked as if the storm were nothing. When the wind grew harsher, he caught sight of her and called out, telling her to stay inside where it was warm. She lingered anyway, until he finally came in, shaking off the rain. Without a word, he reached for a blanket and draped it around her shoulders, his hands brushing lightly against her arms. It was a simple act, but it stole her breath more than any kiss could have. She searched his face for some hint of what he wanted from her, but found only that same calm steadiness. That night, as the fire burned low, she caught herself speaking to him, not out of obligation, but because she wanted to. She told him small things, about the orchard near her childhood home, about the sound of the river in spring. He listened without interrupting, as though her words were worth more than she believed. When she finally fell silent, the quiet between them felt different, no longer the wary distance of strangers, but the tentative closeness of two people who had begun to see each other not as roles assigned, but as lives worth knowing. Spring arrived slowly, creeping into the valley with the scent of thawed earth and the whisper of new leaves. The snowmelt swelled the streams, and the hills turned green almost overnight. Serena found herself outside more often, drawn into the rhythm of the land. She learned how to knead dough until it felt alive beneath her hands, how to tell when a storm was coming by the tilt of the clouds. He never pushed her to do these things, he simply left space for her to step into them on her own. One morning, she woke before him and stood in the doorway watching the sunrise spill gold across the fields. She realized then that she no longer counted the days since she had been brought here. The fear and bitterness that had once clung to her like a second skin had loosened, replaced by something she hadn't dared name. That evening, as the light faded and the air cooled, he returned from the woods carrying a small bundle wrapped in cloth. He set it on the table and opened it to reveal a hair comb carved from pale wood, its surface polished smooth. "I made it," he said, a little awkwardly, as though he were unsure if the gift would be welcome. She took it in her hands, tracing the fine lines of the carving. No one had given her a gift without expecting something in return for as long as she could remember. Her throat tightened, and for a moment she couldn't speak. When she finally met his eyes, she saw the truth she had been circling for weeks. He did not see her as a punishment given, nor as a burden to endure. That night, as they sat by the fire, she reached for his hand. His fingers curled gently around hers, not in possession, but in answer. The world outside their small home was still the same, full of harsh lords and cold judgments. But within these walls, she had found something she never thought she would again. It was not the life she had chosen, but it had become the life she wanted. And in the quiet glow of the hearth, she understood that he had never once seen her as less than a queen.